"That dress looks like it came from a dumpster, dear. Are you sure you're in the right house?" Those were the first words Catherine Montgomery said to the woman who would one day hold the fate of the entire Montgomery empire in her hands. When Sophie walked into that ballroom, she was wearing a $20 thrift store dress and scuffed heels, clutching the arm of a man she loved more than life itself. The Montgomerys thought she was a nobody. They thought she was a gold digger from the wrong side of the tracks. They laughed, they sneered, and they humiliated her in front of the city's elite. But they made one fatal mistake. They didn't check who she really was. And by the time the truth came out, it wasn't just a party that was ruined, it was their entire world. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the 2014 Honda Civic, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud against the pristine silence of the Connecticut countryside. Sophie Clark gripped the passenger door handle until her knuckles turned white, her breath catching in her throat as the iron gates of the Montgomery estate loomed into view. "Deeply, Sophie," Ethan said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. His palm was warm, a stark contrast to the icy dread settling in her stomach. "It's just a dinner party. Just my parents, a few friends. They're going to love you." Sophie forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Ethan Montgomery, with his messy blonde hair and kind hazel eyes, was the sweetest man she had ever met. He was a junior architect she'd met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn 6 months ago. He believed she was a struggling freelance graphic designer, living paycheck to paycheck. He believed she coupon-clipped because she had to, and that her refusal to go to expensive restaurants was a matter of budget, not preference. He didn't know that Sophie Clark was actually Sophia Vanderwall, sole heiress to the Vanderwall tech conglomerate, a woman whose personal net worth could buy and sell his parents' estate 3 times over. She had spent her entire life being courted for her name, her connections, and her trust fund. When she moved to New York, she had dropped the last name, rented a studio apartment in Bushwick, and vowed to find someone who loved her for her. And she had found Ethan. But now, she was about to face the ultimate test: his family. "Your mother sounded specific on the phone," Sophie said, tugging at the hem of her floral sundress. It was a simple thing she'd bought at a consignment shop in the village. To her it was comfortable. To the Montgomerys, she feared, it would look like a rag. "Mother is just particular," Ethan sighed, downshifting as they wound up the long driveway lined with manicured oaks. "She has old-fashioned ideas about status, but she loves me. Once she sees how happy you make me, none of that other stuff will matter." Sophie looked out the window. The house was a sprawling Georgian manor that looked more like a museum than a home. Expensive cars, Mercedes, Bentleys, a vintage Porsche, were already lined up in the circular driveway. "I thought you said it was a small dinner," Sophie whispered. Ethan winced. "I might have downplayed it. It's their annual summer solstice gathering, maybe 50 people. But don't worry, you'll stick with me." As they parked the battered Honda between a Range Rover and a Jaguar, a valet in a crisp white jacket hesitated before approaching them, looking at the car with visible confusion. Sophie stepped out. The evening air was humid, and she immediately felt underdressed. She wasn't wearing jewelry. She never did, not since the incident with her ex-fiancé 2 years ago, and her hair was pulled back in a simple, slightly messy bun. "Ready?" Ethan offered his arm, his smile unwavering. "As I'll ever be," she murmured. They walked up the stone steps to the massive double doors. Before they could even knock, the doors swung open. A butler, looking solemn, ushered them into a foyer that smelled of lilies and old money. The chatter of the party drifted from the next room, the clinking of crystal and the hum of polite, wealthy laughter. And then she appeared. Catherine Montgomery descended the grand staircase like a queen approaching a peasant. She was wearing a silver Valentino gown that shimmered under the chandelier's light. Her hair was a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde lacquer, and her eyes, sharp, blue and assessing, locked onto Sophie like a predator spotting a wounded gazelle. "Ethan," Catherine said, her voice smooth but lacking warmth. She reached the bottom step and offered her cheek to her son, ignoring Sophie entirely. "You're late. The senator has been asking for you." "Sorry, Mum. Traffic on the I-95, Ethan said, stepping back and pulling Sophie gently forward. "Mum, this is Sophie, the girl I've been telling you about." Catherine's gaze slid to Sophie. It started at her messy bun, travelled down the off-the-rack floral dress, paused judgmentally at the lack of jewellery, and ended on the scuffed heels. The silence stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. "Oh," Catherine said finally. It wasn't a question, it was a dismissal. "Sophie, I see. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery," Sophie said, extending her hand. She kept her voice steady, channeling the boardroom training she had received from her late father. "You have a beautiful home." Catherine didn't take the hand. Instead, she gestured vaguely toward a catering waiter passing by with a tray of champagne. "Thank you, though I'm afraid you might find it a bit overwhelming. We dress for dinner here, dear." Sophie retracted her hand, stinging. "I wasn't aware it was black tie. Ethan said—" "Ethan is a romantic," Catherine cut her off, turning her back on Sophie to address her son. "He often forgets the standards we uphold. But no matter. Since you're here, try not to wander into the library. We have some very fragile artifacts on display. I wouldn't want you to knock anything over." "Mum," Ethan said, his voice dropping in warning. "What?" Catherine smiled, a tight, artificial expression. "I'm just being practical. Come along, Ethan. Isabella is dying to see you." "Isabella?" Ethan stiffened. "Isabella Scott," Catherine said, her eyes glinting. "She just got back from Paris. She's looking radiant, and she's wearing a delightful piece from the new Cartier collection." She glanced pointedly at Sophie's bare neck. Sophie felt a cold knot in her stomach. Isabella Scott. She knew the name. The Scotts were old money, rivals of the Vanderwalls in the tech sector, though far less successful. If Isabella was here, Sophie had to be careful. "I'm not leaving, Sophie," Ethan said firmly. "Fine," Catherine waved a hand dismissively. "Bring her along. Just try to keep her out of the photographs, darling. We're sending them to Tatler, and we want the aesthetic to remain consistent." With that, the matriarch swept away into the ballroom. Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "She hates me." "She doesn't know you," Ethan insisted, looking pained. "She's just protective. Come on, I need a drink, and I bet you do too." They entered the ballroom. It was a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. Sophie felt like an intruder, a stain on a perfect white tablecloth. As they moved through the crowd, she felt eyes on her. Whispers trailed in their wake. "Is that the girl? Look at those shoes. Who brought the help?" Sophie kept her head high, a skill she had mastered during hostile takeovers. She gripped Ethan's arm, reminding herself why she was doing this. She wanted to know if he would defend her. She wanted to know if his love was stronger than his family's prejudice. "Ethan!" A shrill, excited voice pierced the air. A woman in a crimson silk gown detached herself from a group of men near the bar and glided toward them. She was stunning in a sharp, angular way, with dark hair and diamonds dripping from her ears. "Isabella," Ethan said, his politeness strained. Isabella ignored the strain. She threw her arms around his neck, kissing him on the cheek, lingering just a bit too long. "It's been ages. Paris was dreadful without you. I kept thinking about that summer in the Hamptons." She pulled back, her hands resting possessively on his lapels, before finally turning her gaze to Sophie. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes went dead. "And who is this?" Isabella asked, her tone sweet as poison. "Did you hire a new assistant, Ethan? I love how eclectic her style is. Very starving artist chic." "This is Sophie," Ethan said, stepping back to break her contact. "My girlfriend." Isabella's eyebrows shot up. "Girlfriend? Oh, I see." She laughed, a tinkering, cruel sound. "You're doing your man of the people phase again. Like that time you tried to date the barista?" That was adorable. She stepped closer to Sophie, invading her personal space. Isabella smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. "Hi, sweetie," Isabella cooed. "I'm Isabella. I've known Ethan since we were in diapers. Just a little tip, the shrimp puffs are free, so fill up while you can. I know how hard it is to pay for groceries these days." Sophie stared at her. She could buy Isabella's entire wardrobe with the interest her portfolio earned in a single hour. She wanted to say, "Actually, I own the building your favorite boutique rents in Manhattan," but she didn't. Instead, she smiled, a small, pitying smile. "Thanks for the tip," Sophie said softly. "But I'm not really hungry for shrimp. I find bottom feeders give me indigestion." Isabella's smile froze. Ethan let out a sudden, choked sound that might have been a laugh. For a second, the mask slipped, and Isabella looked furious, but before she could retaliate, a bell chimed across the room. "Dinner is served!" Catherine's voice rang out. Isabella leaned in, her voice a low hiss near Sophie's ear. "You might think you're clever, you little stray. But you don't belong here. By the end of the night, you'll be running back to whatever basement you crawled out of. Catherine and I will make sure of it." The dining room was a cavernous hall, dominated by a mahogany table, long enough to seat 30 people. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto settings of fine china and Scott silver. Place cards were hand-calligraphed with gold ink. Sophie scanned the table, looking for her name. Ethan walked beside her, his hand on the small of her back, offering a silent comfort. "Here we are," Ethan said, pointing to 2 seats near the middle. But as they approached, Catherine Montgomery swept in, flanked by her husband, Richard, a tall, imposing man with graying temples and a face like a closed bank vault. "Actually, Ethan," Catherine interrupted, her voice carrying over the chatter of the guests. "There's been a slight change. Senator Miller needs to discuss the zoning permits for the marina project. I've seated you next to him and Richard at the head of the table." Ethan frowned. "And Sophie?" Catherine gestured vaguely toward the far end of the table, near the kitchen doors. "There was a mix-up with the RSVP count. We had to squeeze in an extra chair at the end. I'm sure Sophie doesn't mind. It's cozier down there." "Mom, I'm not leaving her." "It's fine, Ethan," Sophie said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. She saw the trap. If Ethan made a scene now, he would look childish and disrespectful to the senator. Catherine was testing his loyalty to the family business versus his loyalty to her. "Go talk about the zoning. I can handle myself." Ethan looked torn, his jaw clenching. "Are you sure?" "Positive. I'll see you after dessert." Reluctantly, Ethan moved to the head of the table. Sophie walked the long, lonely walk to the foot of the table. Her seat wasn't even a proper dining chair. It was a smaller, armless side chair that had clearly been dragged in from the hallway. To her left was the kitchen door, which swung open every few seconds with a burst of noise and steam. To her right sat an elderly, deaf aunt who was busy arranging her pills on the tablecloth, and directly across from her sat Isabella, Of course. The first course was served, a delicate lobster bisque. Sophie picked up her spoon, noting it was a George III pattern silver. "So, Sophie," Isabella said loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests, mostly wealthy socialites and bored wives of business tycoons. "Ethan tells us you're a graphic designer. That sounds quaint. Who do you design for? Local bake sales? Lost dog flyers?" A ripple of tittering laughter went around the lower end of the table. Sophie blew gently on her soup. "Mostly freelance corporate branding," she lied smoothly. "Startups mostly." "Startups," Catherine called out from the head of the table. She had been watching them like a hawk. "That's code for unemployed, isn't it? Richard, didn't our maid's daughter try to do that? She ended up moving back home within a year." Richard Montgomery didn't even look up from his steak. "Market is tough, requires grit, not for everyone." "Tell us about your family, dear," Catherine continued, raising her voice so the whole table fell silent. "We know so little about you. Where do your people summer?" This was the question Sophie hated most. "I don't have people, Mrs. Montgomery. My parents passed away when I was young. I grew up in the foster system in Ohio." It was a half-truth. Her parents had died young, in a private plane crash, but she had been raised by her grandmother in a penthouse in Monaco and a ranch in Wyoming. But the foster system story was the one she used to filter out people who cared about lineage. A collective gasp went through the room. A woman 2 seats down looked at Sophie as if she were contagious. "Oh," Catherine said, her face twisting into a mask of faux sympathy. "How tragic. A foster child. Well, that explains so much." "Explains what?" Sophie asked, her voice hardening. "The lack of polish," Isabella interjected, swirling her red wine. "It's not your fault, really. You just weren't raised to know how to behave in polite society. You're probably used to fighting for food, aren't you?" Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That is enough." "Sit down, Ethan," Richard barked. It was the first time the father had spoken directly to his son all night. "Don't make a scene." "They are insulting her, Dad." "They are making conversation," Catherine said breezily. "If she's going to be in this world, she needs thicker skin. Unless she's only here for the free meal." Sophie felt the heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't shame, it was rage. Cold, calculating rage. She placed her spoon down gently. "I assure you, Mrs. Montgomery," Sophie said, her voice projecting clearly across the table, "I can afford my own meals. I'm here because I love your son. Though I'm beginning to wonder how someone as kind as Ethan came from a gene pool so shallow." The silence that followed was absolute. A waiter dropped a fork. Catherine's face turned a violent shade of red. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Sophie said. She was done playing the mouse. "You speak about class and breeding, yet you've spent the last hour berating a guest in your own home. Where I come from, that's not high society. That's trashy." Isabella laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Where you come from? The gutter?" Isabella reached for the wine decanter, her eyes locking with Sophie's. With a deliberate, clumsy motion, she knocked the heavy crystal decanter over. Red wine, an expensive 1982 Bordeaux, cascaded across the table and splashed directly onto Sophie's lap, soaking her floral dress in a dark, blood-like stain. "Oops," Isabella said, not looking sorry in the least. "My hand slipped." "Oh well, it's not like that dress was worth anything anyway. I'll write you a check for $20. That should cover it, right?" Sophie stood up, the wet fabric clinging to her legs. She looked at Ethan, who was already rushing toward her, pushing past the senator. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," Ethan said, grabbing a napkin and trying to dab at the stain. He turned to Isabella, his eyes blazing. "You did that on purpose." "Don't be ridiculous, Ethan," Catherine snapped. "It was an accident. Besides, look at her. She's a mess." "Sophie, perhaps it's best if you leave. You're clearly out of your depth, and you're ruining the evening for the senator." Sophie looked around the room. She saw the sneers, the averted eyes, the smug satisfaction on Isabella's face. She saw Richard Montgomery checking his watch, bored. She took a deep breath. She could leave. She could run out crying as they expected, or she could burn it down. "I'm not leaving," Sophie said calmly. "You have no clothes," Catherine scoffed. "You look like a drowned rat." "I have a change of clothes in the car," Sophie lied. She didn't. But she had something better. She had her phone. "I'll go clean up," Sophie said. "But before I do, I think you should know something." "We know everything we need to know," Isabella sneered. Just then, the double doors to the dining room opened again. The butler stepped in, looking flustered, followed by a man in a sharp black suit. He wasn't a guest. He was carrying a briefcase and wearing an earpiece. The room fell silent. Richard Montgomery stood up. "Who is this? This is a private party." The man ignored Richard. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Sophie, standing there, soaked in wine. His expression shifted to one of horror. "Miss van der Waal," the man said, rushing over to her. "My God, are you all right? Security flagged a distress signal from your biometric watch." "Miss... who?" Catherine asked, blinking. Sophie wiped a drop of wine from her chin. She looked at the man, her head of security, who she had told to wait outside the estate gates unless strictly necessary. She must have spiked her heart rate enough to trigger the alert. "I'm fine, Marcus," Sophie said, her voice shifting. Gone was the timid graphic designer. In her place was the CEO. "Just a little spill, but I will need my bag from the car, and perhaps call the helicopter." "Helicopter?" Richard Montgomery sputtered. "What is going on here?" Sophie turned to face the stunned room. She looked at Isabella, whose mouth was hanging open. She looked at Catherine, who looked pale. "You asked about my family," Sophie said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "You asked where my people summer. Well, Catherine, we usually summer on our private island in Greece, but this year I thought I'd slum it in Connecticut." She stepped closer to the head of the table. "My name is Sophia van der Waal, and I think we need to have a talk about your loan application with Van der Waal Bank, Richard. Because as of this morning, I'm the one who approves it." The glass in Catherine's hand shattered on the floor. The sound of Catherine's champagne flute shattering against the imported marble floor echoed like a gunshot. But no one moved to clean it up. The silence in the dining room was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. Richard Montgomery was the first to regain his motor functions. His face, previously a mask of bored arrogance, had drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly and aged. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned the color of parchment. He knew the name. Everyone in that room who had a portfolio worth more than a six-pack of beer knew the name Van der Waal. "Van der Waal," Richard croaked, his voice cracking. "As in, Van der Waal Global Ventures?" Sophie didn't answer immediately. She allowed Marcus, her head of security, to drape his own suit jacket over her shoulders, covering the wine-stained floral dress. The gesture was protective, deferential, the way a knight attends to a queen. She slid her arms into the warmth of the jacket, the smell of expensive wool and faint gun oil replacing the stench of the Merlot Isabella had dumped on her. The very same. Sophie said softly. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the quiet, terrifying authority of someone who signed checks that could alter the GDP of small nations. She turned her gaze to Senator Miller, the man Richard had been so desperate to impress. The senator was staring at Sophie with wide, recognizing eyes. He stood up slowly, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Sophia Vanderwall," the senator breathed, a sudden ingratiating smile plastering itself onto his face. "My apologies. I didn't recognize you without the... Well, I usually see you on the cover of Forbes." "Senator," Sophie acknowledged him with a nod that was barely a tilt of her chin. "I believe you're holding up the zoning permits for the marina project my bank is underwriting. I might have to review the environmental impact reports myself. I hear the wetlands are very fragile." The senator paled. "Now, Miss Vanderwall, I'm sure we can expedite." "We'll see," she cut him off. Then she turned back to the Montgomerys. Catherine was trembling. Her eyes darted from Sophie to Richard, then to the guests who were now whispering feverishly. The humiliation she had tried to inflict on Sophie was boomeranging back with lethal force. She tried to salvage the situation, her socialite programming kicking in despite the shock. "Well," Catherine let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh. "This is quite a surprise. Ethan, why didn't you tell us? This is a wonderful joke. Dressed in rags to test us? How very fairy tale." "It wasn't a joke, Mother," Ethan said. His voice was hollow. Sophie looked at Ethan. He wasn't looking at his parents. He was looking at her, and in his hazel eyes, she didn't see triumph. She saw betrayal. "You're Sophia Vanderwall," Ethan whispered, stepping back as if she were a stranger. The freelance designer story, the studio apartment, the coupons. It was all a lie. "Ethan," Sophie started, her armor cracking just a fraction. "I wanted you to know me, not the money." "You lied to me every single day for 6 months, he said, his voice shaking. "I'll explain everything," she promised, her heart aching at the look on his face. "But right now, I have some business to finish with your parents." She turned her attention to Isabella Scott. The girl in the crimson dress was no longer smirking. She looked like a child who had been caught playing with matches while the house burned down. The Scott family fortune was substantial, yes, perhaps $50 million. But the Vanderwall fortune was in the billions. Isabella had just thrown wine on a woman who could buy the Scott family company, strip it for parts, and turn their headquarters into a parking lot before lunch. "Isabella," Sophie said, stepping closer. The smell of the wine on her dress was pungent, a reminder of the insult. "You mentioned something about a check earlier. $20? Isabella swallowed hard. I was just joking. We were just having fun, Sophie. You know how it is." "I don't, actually," Sophie said coldly. "And it's Ms. Vanderwall to you. And regarding that check, don't bother. But I will be conducting an audit of the Scott accounts held at my bank first thing Monday morning. I seem to recall your father has a significant line of credit coming up for renewal. I'd hate to find out his daughter's clumsiness extends to the family finances." Isabella burst into tears. It wasn't a graceful cry. It was a terrified, ugly sob. She grabbed her clutch and ran toward the patio doors, her heels clicking frantically against the floor, fleeing the scene of her social execution. The room was dead silent again. "Richard," Sophie said, pivoting to the patriarch, "my security team tells me my car is being brought around. But before I leave, I think we need to have a private conversation. The library. Now." "The library," Catherine gasped, clutching her pearls. "But the artifacts—" "I don't care about your artifacts, Catherine," Sophie snapped, her voice like a whip. I care about the $25 million loan your husband defaulted on 3 days ago. The one he's been trying to hide from you." A collective gasp went through the room. The guests looked at Richard. The veneer of the wealthy, perfect Montgomery family cracked wide open. "Get out!" Richard hissed to the guests, his pride finally snapping. "Everyone, get out! Dinner is over!" As the confused and scandalized elite began to scramble for their coats, Sophie didn't wait. She turned and walked out of the dining room, her stained dress flowing behind her, heading straight for the forbidden library. The library was exactly as Sophie had imagined, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes that had likely never been opened, smelling of cedar and pretension. A large fireplace dominated the far wall, unlit. Sophie stood by the heavy oak desk, running a hand over the green leather surface. She didn't sit. She wanted the height advantage. The door opened, and Richard and Catherine entered. Ethan followed a moment later, closing the heavy door behind him. He stood by the entrance, arms crossed, looking at the floor. "You have some nerve," Richard began, blustering in an attempt to regain control. "Coming into my house, humiliating my wife, scaring my guests. Cut the act, Richard," Sophie said, reaching into the inner pocket of the suit jacket Marcus had given her. She pulled out a folded document, not a prop, but a summary report she had received on her phone earlier that day, when she realized where Ethan was taking her. She always did her due diligence. "I know everything." She tossed the paper onto the desk. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of him. "What is this?" Catherine asked, reaching for it. "Don't touch it, Catherine," Richard warned, but it was too late. Catherine picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the lines, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Foreclosure notice. Notice of intent to seize assets." "Richard, what is this?" "Your husband is broke, Catherine," Sophie said flatly. "Technically, he's worse than broke. He's insolvent. The Montgomery shipping business has been bleeding money for 5 years. He's been taking out high-interest loans to maintain this lifestyle, the parties, the cars, the jewels, and he used this house as collateral for the last one. A loan from my bank." Catherine turned to her husband, her face a mask of horror. "Richard, tell me she's lying. You said the market was just fluctuating." "I had it under control," Richard shouted, his face purple. "I was going to close the marina deal with the senator tonight. That would have covered the interest." "But you didn't close it," Sophie pointed out. "Instead, you let your wife and that spoiled brat Isabella insult the only person who could have actually saved you." Richard slumped into a leather armchair, the fight draining out of him. He looked suddenly small. "Why?" Ethan spoke up from the door. His voice was quiet, laced with pain. "Dad, you told me the company was stronger than ever. You tried to force me to quit architecture, to join you because you said you needed an heir for the empire." "There is no empire." "I did it for you," Richard pleaded, looking at his son. "I wanted to leave you something. I couldn't let the Montgomery name die out in mediocrity. So you became a fraud." Ethan shook his head. "And you, Mum, you treated Sophie like dirt because you thought she was poor. Meanwhile, we're the ones who are poor." Catherine sank onto the sofa, weeping into her hands. "I didn't know. I just wanted the best for you, Ethan. Isabella. She comes from a good family. I thought merging with the Scotts would help." "Help cover the debts," Sophie finished for her. "You were selling your son off like a prize horse to save your own skin." The brutality of the truth hung in the air. Sophie looked at them, two people who had seemed so terrifyingly superior just an hour ago. Now, they were just pathetic. "Here is what is going to happen," Sophie said, her voice dropping to a businesslike register. The bank has every right to foreclose on this estate tomorrow morning. I could have the sheriff here by noon to padlock the gates. And frankly, after the way you treated me, I should." Richard looked up, hope and terror warring in his eyes. "Please, Miss Vanderwall, Sophia, don't. This house has been in my family for 4 generations. And you disgraced it in one night," Sophie retorted. She walked around the desk, the heels that Catherine had mocked clicking sharply on the hardwood. She stopped in front of Catherine. "You judged me by my shoes," Sophie said softly. "You judged me by my lack of jewelry. You thought I was nothing because I didn't display my wealth. But real wealth, Catherine, doesn't need to shout. It whispers. And right now, it's whispering that you are a bully." Catherine sobbed harder, unable to look Sophie in the eye. "However," Sophie continued, turning to look at Ethan, "I am not a monster, and I love your son, even if he currently hates me." Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The anger was still there, but the hardness had softened slightly. "I will put a hold on the foreclosure," Sophie said. Richard let out a massive sigh of relief. "Thank you. Oh, thank you." "I'm not finished," Sophie cut him off. "I will restructure your debt. I will give you a payment plan that is actually survivable. But there are conditions." "Anything," Richard said. "Anything." "First," Sophie raised a finger, "you will resign as CEO of Montgomery Shipping. You're incompetent, Richard. You'll appoint a board-approved successor who actually knows how to run a logistics company." Richard flinched but nodded. "Done." "Second," Sophie said, looking at Catherine, "you will write a handwritten apology to me, and not just to me. You will write one to every member of your household staff, the butler, the maids, the valet. Because I saw how you looked at them tonight, and I know if you treat a guest like that, you treat your staff worse. If I hear one report of you mistreating a waiter or a maid, the deal is off, and I take the house." Catherine looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks. I understand." "And third," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time, "you will leave Ethan alone. You will stop trying to control his life, stop trying to set him up with heiresses, and stop telling him his career is not enough. He is twice the man either of you are." She took a deep breath. "The paperwork will be sent to your lawyers on Monday. If you try to fight any of the clauses, I will bury you under so much litigation, your grandchildren will be paying the legal fees." Sophie turned and walked toward the door. She paused as she reached Ethan. He was standing there, blocking her exit. Up close, he looked tired. The events of the night had stripped away his easygoing boyishness. "Ethan," she said softly, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I was scared. I've been used for my money my whole life. I needed to know what was real." "Was any of it real?" Ethan asked. "The girl in the coffee shop, the walks in the park?" "All of it," Sophie said, tears finally pricking her eyes. "That was the real me. Sophia Vanderwall is just a name on a bank account. Sophie, the girl who loves you. She's the one standing right here." Ethan looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, but then he pulled back. "I can't," he whispered. "Not tonight. I don't know who you are right now. I need to think." He stepped aside, opening the door for her. It was the most painful rejection Sophie had ever felt. It hurt more than Catherine's insults, more than Isabella's wine, because this was a wound she had inflicted herself. "I understand," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. She walked out of the library, down the grand hallway, and out the front door. Outside, the air had cooled. The gravel driveway was empty of guests. Most had fled the awkwardness. A sleek, black helicopter was descending onto the great lawn, its rotors kicking up a storm of wind and leaves, flattening the perfectly manicured grass Catherine loved so much. Marcus opened the door of a waiting black SUV that would take her to the chopper. "To the city, miss?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Sophie said, not looking back at the mansion. "Take me home." As the car pulled away, Sophie watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. She had won the war. She had crushed her enemies, saved her dignity, and exerted her power. But as she touched the empty seat beside her, she realized she had lost the only thing that actually mattered. The week following the disastrous summer solstice party, the Montgomery estate felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The silence was thick, pressing against the eardrums, broken only by the occasional sound of a moving box being taped shut. Ethan Montgomery was leaving. He stood in the center of his childhood bedroom, a room that had been preserved as a shrine to his achievements, lacrosse trophies, architectural models from college, framed photos of him on sailboats. But as he looked at them now, they felt like props in a play he hadn't realized he was starring in. Downstairs, the atmosphere was toxic. True to Sophie's demand, Catherine was sitting at the breakfast table, a stack of heavy cream stationery before her. Her hand shook as she held her fountain pen, not from age, but from seething, repressed fury. Ethan walked into the breakfast nook, carrying a duffel bag. He watched his mother for a moment. She wasn't writing apologies. She was performing a penance, and she hated every second of it. "I deeply regret my conduct," Catherine muttered aloud, reading her own script with a sneer. She looked up and saw Ethan. Her expression softened, but the manipulation was still there, lurking behind her eyes. "Ethan, darling, you're not really leaving, are you? Not now. We need to stick together. We're a family." "Are we?" Ethan asked, dropping his bag on the floor. "Because families don't sell each other out." "We didn't sell you out," Catherine protested, capping her pen with a sharp click. "We were trying to secure your future. Isabella is a lovely girl." "Isabella is a viper, Mum," Ethan cut her off. "And you knew it. You watched her humiliate Sophie, humiliate the woman I love, and you laughed. You joined in." "Sophie lied to us," Catherine shot back, her voice shrill. "She pretended to be a pauper. She made fools of us in our own home. How can you defend her? She's a deceiver, Ethan, a manipulator. She played us all." "She didn't play me," Ethan said quietly, though the doubt still gnawed at his gut. "She hid from me." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Catherine stood up, smoothing her skirt. "She watched you struggle to pay for dinners. She watched you drive that terrible car. She could have changed your life with a snap of her fingers, and she didn't. She tested you. That's not love, Ethan. That's a game." Ethan didn't answer. That was the thought that had kept him awake for the last 3 nights. The betrayal. Every time he had offered to pay for her coffee, every time he had worried about her making rent, she had been sitting on $1 billion empire. It made him feel small. It made him feel like a charity case she had been observing for amusement. "I'm leaving, Mum," Ethan said, picking up his bag. "I'm going to stay at a hotel until I find an apartment in the city. I can't be here. I can't look at this house without thinking about the mortgage you defaulted on." "Ethan, wait!" He ignored her and walked toward the heavy oak front door. As he passed the library, the scene of the revelation, he saw his father, Richard. Richard was sitting at his desk, surrounded by boxes. He looked 20 years older. He had already resigned. The board of Montgomery Shipping, upon hearing of the debt restructuring and Sophie's conditions, had wasted no time in accepting his retirement. "Dad," Ethan said, pausing in the doorway. Richard looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. "She's ruthless, you know," Richard said, his voice raspy. "Vanderwall, I looked over the new loan terms. They're fair, generous even. But the control, she owns us now, Ethan. If I step out of line once, she takes it all." "She saved you," Ethan reminded him. "You would have lost it all anyway." "I suppose," Richard sighed. He picked up a picture frame from his desk. It was a photo of Ethan and Sophie from a few months ago, one Ethan had brought home to show them. Sophie was laughing, the wind blowing her hair across her face. She looked so normal, so real. "Did you know?" Richard asked, pointing at the photo. "Did you have any idea?" "No," Ethan said. "I thought she was just Sophie." "Well," Richard placed the photo face down, "if you ever see her again, tell her the first payment has been sent. We aren't late." Ethan walked out of the house, the heavy door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in his chest. He threw his bag into his Honda, the same car that had looked so out of place next to the Bentleys. He drove away from the estate, but he didn't go to a hotel. Not yet. He found himself driving into the city, navigating the chaotic traffic of Manhattan. He drove to Bushwick. He parked in front of the rundown apartment building where Sophie had lived, where she had pretended to live. He stared at the brick facade. The fire escape was rusted. The graffiti on the front door was fresh. He got out and buzzed 4B. No answer. He waited for a tenant to exit and slipped inside. He climbed the 4 flights of stairs, his heart pounding. He knocked on her door. "Sophie?" Silence. He knocked harder. "Sophie, it's Ethan. Please." The door to 4A opened. An elderly woman, Mrs. Higgins, poked her head out. She was wearing a housecoat and holding a cat. "She's gone, honey," Mrs. Higgins said sympathetically. Ethan turned. "Gone? Did she move?" "Moved out 3 days ago," Mrs. Higgins said. "Some men in suits came. Big men, moving trucks that looked like armored cars. They packed everything up in an hour. She left the keys with the super." "Did she leave a note?" Ethan asked, feeling a desperate lump in his throat. Mrs. Higgins shook her head. "No note. But she left this." The old woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, potted succulent. It was a cheap little plant Ethan had bought Sophie on their second date. He had jokingly told her it was a low-maintenance commitment. "She told the movers to throw it out," Mrs. Higgins said. "Said she didn't want anything from her old life. But I kept it. Seemed a shame to let it die." Ethan took the plant. The ceramic pot was cold in his hands. She didn't want anything from her old life. That included him. Ethan realized then that Catherine was wrong. Sophie hadn't been playing a game. She had been building a fantasy, a life where she could be normal. And by bringing her to that party, by letting his family tear her down, Ethan had shattered that fantasy. Sophia Vanderwall had retreated to her castle, and she had pulled up the drawbridge. 2 weeks had passed since the summer solstice disaster, and Ethan Montgomery was living like a ghost. He had moved out of the estate that very night, checking into a nondescript hotel in the city. He refused to answer Catherine's frantic texts or Isabella's tearful, drunken voicemails. But he couldn't just walk away, not without understanding the full truth. On a rainy Tuesday, Ethan returned to the Montgomery estate while his parents were out meeting lawyers. He went straight to his father's study, looking for answers. He found them in a manila folder, buried under a stack of foreclosure notices. It was labeled Project Scott. As he read the documents, a cold chill settled in his bones. It wasn't just a casual setup between childhood friends. It was a calculated merger. His parents had been trading emails with Isabella's father for months, promising Ethan's hand in marriage in exchange for a $50 million liquidity injection into Montgomery shipping. He hadn't just been a son to them, he had been a bargaining chip. Sophie was right. They were transactions. Ethan threw the file down, grabbing his coat. He drove straight to Bushwick, to the rundown apartment building where he had fallen in love. He needed to apologize. He needed to tell her that he finally understood why she had hidden her wealth, because in a world of people like his parents, money was a target on your back. He ran up the 4 flights of stairs and pounded on door 4B. There was no answer. The door to the adjacent apartment creaked open. Mrs. Higgins, the elderly neighbor, peered out. "She's gone, honey. Men in suits came 3 days ago, cleared the place out." Ethan felt the floor drop out from under him. "Did she leave a note?" "No note," Mrs. Higgins said softly. She reached behind her door and pulled out a small, sad-looking potted succulent, the one Ethan had bought Sophie for $3 on their second date. But she told the movers to trash this, said she didn't want any reminders of her fake life. I couldn't bear to throw it out. Ethan took the plant. The ceramic pot was cold in his hands. A fake life. That's what she thought they were. He knew where he had to go. The Vanderwall Tower pierced the grey Manhattan sky like a shard of black ice. It was intimidating, cold and impenetrable, a fortress built to keep the world out. Ethan walked into the lobby, dripping wet from the rain, clutching the potted plant against his chest. The security was tighter than the Pentagon. "I need to see Sophia Vanderwall," Ethan told the receptionist. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, not even looking up. "No, but—" "Then you need to leave, sir." Ethan turned away, frustration burning his throat. But before he reached the revolving doors, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Marcus, the massive head of security from the party. "You have some nerve showing up here," Marcus rumbled. "I know," Ethan said, not backing down. "But I'm not leaving until I see her. My parents. They tried to sell me, Marcus. I just found the paperwork. I need her to know that I get it now. I get why she hid." Marcus studied him for a long, tense moment. He looked at the cheap plant in Ethan's hands, then at the desperation in his eyes. "She's on the roof," Marcus said quietly. "She goes there when the pressure gets too high. Penthouse access. You have 5 minutes before I have to do my job and throw you out." He swiped his keycard. "Go." The elevator ride to the 80th floor was a silent ascent into the clouds. When the doors opened, the wind hit Ethan instantly. The rooftop terrace was a sleek expanse of glass and steel overlooking the entire city. Sophie was standing at the edge, staring out at the Empire State Building. She wasn't wearing the soft floral dresses he loved. She was armored in a sharp, black power suit, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She looked like a statue, beautiful, powerful, and utterly alone. "I told you I didn't want to be disturbed, Marcus," she called out over the wind, not turning around. "It's not Marcus," Ethan said. Sophie froze. She turned slowly. When she saw him, her mask of indifference cracked. For a second, she looked exhausted. "How did you get up here?" "I walked," Ethan said, stepping into the rain. "Marcus let me in. He thinks you're unhappy." "I'm perfectly fine," she lied, her voice trembling slightly. "Go away, Ethan. You made your choice in the library. You couldn't handle the truth." "I couldn't handle the shock," Ethan corrected, stepping closer. "But I went to the apartment today. Mrs. Higgins gave me this." He held out the succulent. The rain was matting his hair, ruining his shoes, but he didn't care. "She said you wanted to throw away your old life," Ethan said. I'm hoping you didn't mean all of it." Sophie stared at the plant. Her eyes welled up. "That life wasn't real, Ethan. The girl who clipped coupons, the girl who worried about rent, that was a performance." "No," Ethan said firmly. "The bank account was fake. The last name was fake. But the girl who sat on a park bench with me for 3 hours talking about Star Wars, that was real. The girl who held my hand when I didn't get that promotion, that was real." He closed the distance between them, standing just inches away. "I don't care about the money, Sophie. I don't care about the tower. I just want the girl who bought a $3 plant because she didn't want it to be lonely." Sophie looked at him, the tears finally spilling over. "I was so scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've been used for my money since I was born. I just wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for me." "I love you," Ethan said. "Rich, poor, or complicated. I love you." Sophie let out a sob and collapsed into his arms. Ethan held her tight, shielding her from the rain and the world below. For a moment, the billionaire CEO vanished, and she was just Sophie again. But the peace was shattered by the ding of the elevator. "Miss Vanderwall!" Her assistant rushed onto the roof, looking panicked. "I'm sorry, but the board of directors has called an emergency vote. They found out about the debt restructure for the Montgomery estate. They're calling it a conflict of interest. They're moving to strip you of your CEO title immediately." Sophie pulled back from Ethan, her face hardening instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the steel of a woman who had fought for everything she had. "They want a war?" she hissed, wiping the rain from her face. She looked at Ethan, conflict in her eyes. "I have to go. If I lose this vote, I lose my father's legacy." "Then let's go," Ethan said, taking her hand. "But you're not going in there alone." Sophie looked at him, surprised. "What can you do? You're an architect." Ethan smiled, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Exactly. They think that estate is a liability. I'm going to show them it's the most valuable asset they have. Let's go save your company." The boardroom of Vanderwall Global Ventures was a shark tank, disguised as an office. 12 men and women in grey suits sat around a glass table, their eyes fixed on Sophie. "The loan to the Montgomery estate is a liability," the chairman, a man named Scott, Isabella's uncle, declared, slamming his hand on the table. "You used company funds to bail out your boyfriend's bankrupt parents. It's a conflict of interest, Sophia. We're moving to revoke your executive powers pending an investigation." Sophie stood at the head of the table, her hands flat on the glass. She was fighting for her life, but she was losing. The Montgomery estate is a prime asset. It holds strategic value for our coastal development portfolio. "It's a money pit," Scott shouted. "And the son? He's a junior architect with no portfolio. You're betting millions on a failing family." Just then, the heavy double doors swung open. Security moved to intercept, but Marcus stepped aside. Ethan Montgomery walked in. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo, and he wasn't wearing his rain-soaked jacket. He was wearing a simple shirt and slacks, carrying a large roll of blueprints. "I'm not just a junior architect," Ethan said, his voice steady, echoing off the glass walls. "And that estate isn't a money pit. It's a gold mine, if you know what to do with it." "Who let this man in?" Scott demanded. "I did," Sophie said, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. Ethan unrolled the blueprints across the table, covering the foreclosure documents. "My father wanted to build a standard marina. It would have failed. But this," Ethan pointed to his design, "is a sustainable, high-end eco-resort that utilizes the wetlands rather than destroying them. It qualifies for 3 different federal tax credits and projects a 200% return within 2 years. The room went silent. The board members leaned in. The math was undeniable. The design was brilliant. Vanderwall Bank didn't just buy a debt, Ethan said, looking directly at Scott. We bought the future, and I'm donating the design to the bank, free of charge. Scott looked at the plans, then at Sophie. He slowly sat back down. 200% return? Conservative estimate, Sophie added, seamlessly stepping back into her power, aligning herself with Ethan. So, gentlemen, are we voting to remove me, or are we voting to make a fortune? The vote was unanimous. Sophie stayed. 3 months later, the summer solstice party was held again at the Montgomery estate. But things were different. Catherine was no longer the hostess. She was quietly organizing the catering staff, fearful of making a mistake. Richard was sitting in the corner, drinking sparkling water, stripped of his CEO title. Sophie walked in. She wasn't wearing a ball gown. She was wearing a simple, elegant floral dress, and on her finger was a modest, beautiful engagement ring. Ethan took her hand. Ready to face them? I don't need to face them, Sophie smiled, looking at the man who had saved her empire with his talent, just as she had saved his family with her mercy. I'm just looking at you. As they danced, Isabella Scott watched from the sidelines, bitter and ignored, while the poor girl she had mocked spun in the arms of the man she loved, proving once and for all that the most expensive thing in the room wasn't the jewelry, it was the truth. So the Montgomerys learned the hard way that you never judge someone by the shoes they wear or the car they drive. Catherine and Isabella thought power came from humiliating others, but they discovered that true power is quiet, kind, and capable of destroying you with a single signature. Sophie didn't just teach them a lesson about money. She taught them that dignity isn't something you buy. It's something you are. And in the end, the woman they tried to treat like trash turned out to be the only treasure they couldn't afford to lose. If you think Sophie was right to put her in-laws in their place, hit that like button. What would you have done if your mother-in-law treated you like that? Would you have saved them, or let them go broke? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching.